to come, unfortunately. So I reframed today's lesson. I really apologize. We just weren't able to get him in. So instead, we're going to do two things. One is I'm going to cover some of the material in detail that you guys read about in the last lesson. And then two, there was a portion on lead gen that I feel like would be really helpful to go through and talk about with examples. So when we get to that section, we can either do one of two things. We can either open it up for questions and discussion and maybe talk about some interesting topics that are not being covered, or we can go more into lead gen and maybe talk about stuff through a real life example with tooling. Because I know one piece of feedback that people gave was, hey, I wish I could like see some of these examples in practice. And so if we have some additional time, I might be able to share my screen and we can talk through some of these things with Clarify Stack, or if somebody wants to share their screen, they can do that as well. Sound good? Cool. Hour and a half left of the RevTech class. Thank you guys for your time so far. Today, we're going to cover 4 different things, or I guess 3 different things. Auditing your stack, lead gen tactics, and how I'm growing pipeline at Clarify. This will be the demo discussion-based section. This is obviously only super helpful for, I think, pre-scale and maybe post-product market scale companies. For companies that are in growth and enterprise, that's not going to be necessarily a helpful demo, but I can pull up a stack diagram and we can talk through it if that fits your stage better. So let's talk about auditing your stack and why this is important. Really, what we get into here, I think, is a great lesson for teams that are going through growth and scale and enterprise. If you think back to our lesson from a couple of weeks ago, and we talk about the different life cycles of companies, when you're in pre and post product market fit, you're not exactly thinking about some of the things we're talking about today. It doesn't mean they're not important. It's just that the number one goal of the company is to stay alive. And so as you kind of exit that feeling of default alive, then these things start to become more important. Again, there's not like oh, I realize I'm not showing my screen, am I? Let me actually do that because that would be really helpful, I'm sure, for you guys to be able to see my screen. Sorry about that. One second. Okay, there we go. I apologize for that, my friends. Just so you can see, I only went over 2 slides, so you didn't miss much. This was just the slide that I led with. So I was giving some context on why this is important, and you guys might have seen this framework from the discussion that I posted online. There's really 2 reasons why we have this framework. One is to think about the symptoms that lead to an inefficient stack, and then what are some of those root causes that we can dissect and then put solutions in place for in order to make the stack more efficient. Everybody likes to think that a stack is just problematic because of the tools, but it's actually not. It's usually not just the tools. In fact, I think probably 90% of the time, it's not the tools that are the problem. It's the stuff around the tools, the rituals, the connections, and some of these other symptoms that you see occurring because of the choices that you've made with regard to the Frick framework that we talked about. So let's diagnose some of these, talk about them, and then go into detail. The first is like, what are symptoms of a bad stack? I showed you before, some of these things at the top. These are the things that you feel. These are the things that people complain about. And I think like it's important to separate symptoms from causes, right? Symptoms are things sort of like if you think about being unwell or being sick, if you catch a virus or you have a bacterial infection, it's not exactly describing your state. Your symptoms are what classify how you feel. And so often when you get complaints about the stack, when you hear frustrations, when you notice problems, those are the symptoms that you want to start dialoguing around. Examples would be, user frustration. That's like the number one thing I see and feel in growth stage and enterprise companies is people complaining. I have a problem. This is hard. It never works. This thing is always broken. Another thing you guys might feel as operators is data silo. So I have all this data in one place or I don't. It's hard for me to find the context. It's hard for me to communicate the context about where stuff lives. Obviously, clunky reporting. Clunky is just like a very basic word to capture many different types of reporting problems. I think the biggest one in clunky, though, with clunky reporting is that you'll have a situation where most of the organization knows how reporting is done, but there's some small subset of users who are usually non-technical who want to report in a different way. And so this is tied to data silos, because if you have a single source of truth and a single way of reporting, life is pretty easy. But most of the times people have multiple sources of truth with multiple sources of reporting, and they're trying to compare apples to oranges. And so a symptom would be, hey, the data is never right. It never matches what other people are saying, or I don't know how to self-serve. Um, Inefficient workflows, I would also just qualify this as not only inefficient workflows, but everybody knows the problem of workflows that never seem to do what you want and always seem to cause problems. This is a function, I think most people experience this when they're like in a traditional CRM or CDP and they're at scale, or they're in a small CRM or CDP and they're using a tool like Zapier. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, about this idea of becoming production grade and what that means. But I think a really common symptom of a stack that's maybe not fitting your size and stage is where you feel like workflows don't work for you. And then the most common one is just bad data hygiene. This is particularly the case with CDPs where, there's just not good nomenclature around how to name events and user attributes and user events. And so over time, your instance kind of comes polluted with data that doesn't make sense. So we talked about symptoms. We talked about inefficient workflows, clunky reporting, user frustration, siloed data. So what are some of the things that, like, I would say exacerbate these symptoms? It's like you're sick with a cold and you decide to go to work. Well, the number one thing that I've seen that kind of helps exacerbate some of these problems is believing that you have to continue doing something ritualistically because you've always done it. And an example of this would be a backfill. So for folks who are not sure what I'm talking about with a backfill, it's where your data becomes out of sync between tools, and you kind of believe that you have to continue putting data into alternative tools to keep all your tools kind of in state with one another. An example would be like, oh, we had an outage in Salesforce, so now we need to backfill that Salesforce data into HubSpot or Segment or some other tool upstream. These are like incredibly risky endeavors. This is like, in my mind, performing like heart surgery or brain surgery on your stack. And yet it becomes really normalized because I think operators outside of RevTech and MarTech don't really understand how complicated these things are. And also becomes normalized because, again, if you want to have a single source of truth, there can be this belief that all your tools have to be syndicated with one another. And I'm just here to say that's an example of a really bad exacerbation. We can talk about more in a second. So let's start with some questions here. I'm actually curious to hear from the team. Are there other examples of activities that your teams do that maybe don't serve you, or that you notice that you just do because maybe a rev leader said you have to do it, or a growth leader said you have to do it, but doesn't actually make sense?
We unfortunately have a separate system for clients. So system of record when we're prospecting is Salesforce. When we sign a contract, everything transitions to a different system, Jira. And that's our system of record as long as they are clients. When they decommission, technically speaking, they're flowing back into our CRM, which has not really been updated because the client team don't have Salesforce licenses. And we'd like to understand when client alumni are leaving to other companies because they're really our champions. And that is cumbersome at the moment. And IT will not allow me to tie Jira and Salesforce together because we are dealing with personal health information. So I have a complete firewall between, and as of now, they're not even allowing me to do some with an intermittent data warehouse and so on. So our sales organization cannot really leverage much from the client side, which is unfortunate.
Sounds like there's two problems. There's a physical limitation that is hard to overcome, which is that you deal with health data. So that's a hard block. But there's maybe an easier solution, which is just why don't we have Salesforce seats for these people who could then access that data,
That's a financial decision.
Exactly. I mean, that's a great example, though, of an over, an achievable barrier, but one that's put in place that kind of limits self-limiting to you and your team.
Jira is supposed to be cloud only in a year or two, and at that point, I think that will be my window of opportunity to at least get those two systems integrated enough that we can pass information between. So I'm focusing on other projects at the moment.
I love it. Letting some fires burn, which is totally fine.
That's how I had to wait for Salesforce for Outlook. They wouldn't give me because our Exchange server was on-prem. Then we got to Office 365, and then that problem thawed and disappeared by itself.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else have a similar problem of like an activity that's become ritualized that doesn't serve you anymore? That's okay. Maybe something will speak to you. I'll give you a great example from.
Uh,
Go ahead.
Oftentimes, it's about entering data for the purpose of reporting, but those metrics are never actually measured. So it's important to know the owner of a particular business function, what they're going to measure, and then calibrate reports to that.
I love that example. Yeah, we experienced this at Ramp, and we started asking the question around why are we tracking fields that never get reported. So we actually set up a report that would tell us when fields were reported on. So for every field on a Salesforce object, if there wasn't a report on the field within 90 days, we would alert ourselves and say, nobody's done anything with this data in 90 days, so why the hell are we collecting it? Which can, I mean, it can be tough, right? Like, I think a lot of leaders will push back on that and say, well, one day we might need it. Like, there might become an opportunity where we need it. But, holding on to data and making your life harder and more complicated for the one-off use case that you might need in the future is a great way to find yourself into tech debt. So yeah, thank you guys for sharing. The example I wanted to share from Ramp, which is what you see on the screen, was this idea behind a backfill. And so I'll share this example and I'll share the solution because it may be broadly applicable to lots of situations where you maybe are dealing with something uncomfortable and unfortunate, and you want to figure out, like, how do I get this out of my life? Like, how do I stop having to deal with this? So in our case, it was this idea of a backfill. Anytime a part of the stack would break, we would have to do a backfill, and it was just expected. Clearbit went down for a little while, I got to do backfill. We lost some leads inside Salesforce. The leads are there, but like all the data from the warehouse and Segment and HubSpot isn't on them. So let's do a backfill. And we had two kind of problems occurring at the same time. One was there's so many issues across the technology landscape that we could never really say there wouldn't be problems. So we're like dealing with the deluge of problems occurring. And every time a problem occurred, we would have to kind of like take a week to do a backfill on a specific tool. And it was really hard, but we basically had to put some rules in place to say, what's the purpose? Well, yeah, before I say talk about rules, like we actually went to our head of growth and said, like, what's the purpose of the backfill? And where are you looking at this data? And we ultimately found was that the primary source of information, and I apologize, I got to let somebody in. Primary source of information was in the warehouse, and they're able to do SQL reporting in the warehouse. So they didn't actually care. The leader didn't actually care about the data being everywhere in the stack. It was that there were a handful of business analysts who thought that it was important. And so they were kind of pushing an agenda, not really questioning why. And so what we had to do is actually kind of go above our peers, go above our business associates and analysts, and go to the person who's actually consuming the data as a directly accountable person and ask that question. What are you actually trying to achieve? Why is this important? How can we achieve this outcome in the same way? And the outcome we came to was like, actually, you don't need backfills. What you need is clear data at the end of the month to report to our CEO so that you're successful and you can be held accountable. And so we said to ourselves, well, look, and unless there's a problem with downstream reporting into Snowflake, it doesn't actually matter if something breaks inside Salesforce and then recovers, because all that data will originate inside of the warehouse. So once we kind of came to that determination, we built a plan with the head of growth that said, look, we're going to stop this process. We're going to stop doing backfills because they're no longer important. by going to that person first and getting their buy-in on the plan, it made it easier to then go back to all the people who are kind of adhering to this policy process. And ultimately we came up with was this philosophy that was like, hey, here are the contexts in which we should be doing backfills. Here are the contexts in which we shouldn't. And if we're going to do a backfill, here are the things that you, as a business analyst or a data engineer or somebody else, need to do in order for us to process it. Because I think an additional problem, which I'm sure you guys all probably feel, is that it's not only about the issue itself, but it's how it's presented. I could probably get everybody to raise their hand the time they've been looped into a Slack chain where there's like a massive issue and no context, right? And so some of this was about, okay, well, let's standardize the way in which we get that context. Now, I would qualify that this particular problem at Ramp was occurring literally every week. So you might not go to such great lengths for a problem that occurs once a quarter or once a year. But if there is an issue with the stack that's occurring on a weekly basis, and you feel like, hey, we're not really making any progress at getting this issue to go away, or the same things seems to be happening again and again, what I would recommend is like kind of back up and ask yourself the question, like, do you need to be doing this thing at all? If so, what's the solution? If so, what's the process and plan? Get buy-in and then deliver the plan. So that's a little about the Ramp case. I want to pause for a second. Any questions about this? Any applications to maybe some other problems that people are dealing with internally that might be coming up in the stack? Cool. I mean, just a general question then. Like, have people been in situations where they have to do backfills across every part of their stack because they believe that all the tools have to be syndicated with one another?
Austin, I just got here, so I missed the first part of this, but when you're talking about backfills here, are we talking about like backfilling account information or like properties of accounts and properties of contacts?
Thank you for volunteering, Shai. Now I'll just put you on the spot here. So the high level theme is about, hey, we were talking before about symptoms versus root causes. And a symptom would be something like this, like how I'm feeling, and a cause would be what are the actual root causes of the symptoms you're feeling. And I was highlighting a case study from Ramp where the symptoms that we're feeling was, hey, it's really hard every week to do backfills. It takes a lot of time. Nobody's really clear why we're doing it. It's not clear where the data is being used. And an example of a backfill would come from, hey, like there was some issue. Somebody made a change in Salesforce, which prevented leads from being routed properly for 10 minutes. So we like quote unquote lost 100 leads. So those 100 leads now are not synced with HubSpot with all the properties and fields about how they're routed, but the data is in the warehouse. So the question is like, okay, in this case, there's backfilling the data, making sure data is accurate between HubSpot and Salesforce and the warehouse. And then there's triaging the actual leads. And it was always very easy to be like, hey, I'm going to take those 100 leads and triage them so that sales doesn't miss a beat. But there's this additional question of like, do we go to great lengths to make sure that the field and data that was lost in that 10 period minutes of time, we get that from the warehouse and pipe it back into the Salesforce instance or into HubSpot. And what I was sharing with the team is that upon some further discovery, we found that like that wasn't really necessary because it was in the warehouse. And so the question I'm really posing to everybody here is, what are examples of instances where your team is doing something that is not useful, right? That you believe is not useful and you have evidence of being not useful, but you're stuck kind of in a position continuing to do it because it's become status quo. That's the primary question I'm getting at. And I'm looking for people with examples.
Yeah, so I'll volunteer. It's maybe like tangentially related. So in that context, we tend to approach those types of things like if the missing data can be actioned in such a way that it's going to drive reasonable or meaningful revenue, is we kind of just treat it as an opportunity against every other thing that we have to do. And just from that lens, we don't worry too much about the data integrity in the CRM itself, but we're sort of evolving that right now. Like, everyone kind of treated the CRM as the source of truth for revenue, where we're kind of pushing away from that slowly. But yeah, we don't backfill for the sake of backfilling at the moment, but we do it when there is substantial like revenue opportunity that was missed.
Love that. So framing business problems in terms of revenue is a great way to prioritize, right? Cool. I won't let anybody else. I won't make anybody else suffer here. But yeah, it's a great example. Thanks for sharing, Shai. So another problem that I want to come up with or talk about, which maybe is a little bit more near and dear to people's hearts, is the idea of like there's an unsolved problem in the stack, right? I'm sure people here have dealt with that. It's Monday morning, 9 a.m., and something's broken. Leads are not working. People aren't getting routed. This field is missing. I got this alert in HubSpot about something I don't know what the fuck to do with. And these are all examples of investigations. And this is another example of like symptom versus root cause. If we talk about this framework here, something's not working. I'm frustrated. It's broken. All of these symptoms, often what they do is they lead to the degradation of trust in your team and the stack. So it's important to kind of separate what is the symptom you're feeling, what's the thing that is going on, from what is the root cause of that issue. Now, for a lot of unscaled organizations, these investigations happen in Slack, they happen ad hoc. And if you have a really big team, it's easy to find yourself in a position where like people are jumping in, trying to solve the problem in an unsystematic way. And that's where actually we experienced some problems at Ramp was, hey, there's not a systematic way that we're debugging and solving problems, which lead to us being in debugging hell, where we're not actually sure how to solve the problem. There's not a clear process. There's not a clear owner. There's not a methodology to follow to work backwards from where you saw the problem to where it might originate. And so again, solution here is not rocket science. Like in both these cases, what I've been showing you is literally just an RFC guide. But what it does is it says, we're going to take a problem that's recurring and we're going to put a process around it so that when somebody else encounters the exact same problem, they have a playbook to follow. And over time, the hope and intention is that within your team in Revenue Tech or MarTech, you've developed a lot of these different RFCs or SOPs or guidebooks, you could call them run books even, of here's a specific problem, here's how we go about solving it. And whether you find the problem or data finds the problem or growth finds the problem, you can kind of gather the team around a common way of solving and finding the solution, which to me represents like most of the way this is how you like figure out the root cause, is you go from symptom and then you start figuring out the root cause through some type of process. So root causes, underlying factors that lead to the symptoms, can be because of a ritual, can be because of a connection, because of a tool. But in all those cases, the way to solve a root cause is to have your own process in place for untangling those different situations. In our case, I think at Ramp, what was a really distinctive problem is that we had a lot of people who were eager to help, many of whom were not necessarily qualified to investigate the stack itself. And so what would happen is we would be in a Slack channel, we'd create an incident report, and we'd start talking about the problem. And all of a sudden there would be maybe 10, 15 people weighing in with different pieces of information, but none of that was actually leading us on a pathway to resolution. And so it'd be, the problem would start at 9 a.m., we'd get to 4 p.m. and there'd be effectively no solution. There'd be like, there's no real pathway. Like nobody had figured out what to do. And what this process really put in place and did was to systemize the way that you work from the bottom of the stack upwards. So I wish I'd included this diagram. That was dumb of me. But all the diagrams we've showed you've seen the funnel basically going down. And the reason I emphasize that funnel is because when it comes to debugging and to systems problems, you basically want to flip it on its head and work your way in the opposite direction. So if there's a problem that's happening in Salesforce it often originates upwards in the stack with all the connected tools. Now, part of the challenge that we've talked about before is that if you have many connected tools that are coupled to one another, it can make it hard to figure out, is the root cause because of a connected tool connected to another tool, or is the root cause actually upstream? So the goal in this investigation guide, and the goal, I think, of any root cause analysis is to try to separate the problem into as many bespoke pieces as possible and work your way up the value chain to figure out where it originated from, as opposed to kind of like going in a random direction. Usually what I do, especially with systems problems, is there's always like the one or two attempts of gut check, like, hey, I just know enough about our stack and I know enough about the problem space to maybe guess what the issue is. But if that doesn't resolve in a root cause analysis, that's when I kind of default back to a more kind of method-driven approach of pick a spot in the stack to start, work your way up the connection chain to where the problem might lie. So we talked about root cause in terms of, sorry, I must have missed that slide here. Where did it go? Talked about process and rituals, things that you can do to help make it better. And we can talk about connections as well. So with connections, which is going to really kind of encapsulate the integrations and data flows between systems, this is where having a clear guide, either in your investigation process or whatever you create, is really important. So this is like literally part of the investigation report that I just showed above. You'll have like a tool, connection location, connection type, reason for integration, and identify gaps or issues. Having this live separately from your incident report is a great way for everybody to understand how these things are connected. So at the beginning of the class, we talked about, hey, you got to have data diagram. I think in addition to having data diagram, having some type of vendor mapping where you actually list out, these are the tools, these are the connections, this is the reason for the integration. This actually helps in the future when we talk about vendor swapping. So when we go to talk about, I want to change tools, the reason for an integration is often like one of the most important things that you need in order to make the change and persuade people in making a change. A great example that I'll share briefly at Ramp was we had Intercom. I have no qualms to Intercom. I've used Intercom a bunch. But what I hated about the process of changing from Intercom was that it seemed like nobody in the organization understood why we chose Intercom. Yet everybody had been there for the 2 years. It was like, I don't know who chose this tool. Nobody will tell me why. Like the original integration person was the VP of product. I can't get his time. So like there's just this missing knowledge gap around what was the original intention of this tool? Is that now solving the original intention or not? And so I would argue, especially if you're in like the growth stage of a company, this thing won't exist. This artifact won't exist. But if you can go create it, maybe like as part of either a quarterly audit or your first couple weeks in office, this can be one of the most helpful things for you ever, because it's basically a living document of why people make decisions and why the decisions were important. And again, I would argue this is like the simplest thing ever to create with GPT. You could say, hey, here's like a list of all the tools we have in our stack. I want you to create columns of these 4 types. Go have conversations with head of product, growth engineers, head of growth. Ask the types of questions. You may even pre-prompt these questions around, like, I'm really curious why you chose XYZ. I'm really curious who set up this tool. I'm really curious what problem it was solving. I'm really curious if like you felt any problems with our tools. Throw all those transcripts into GPT and you'll have an incredible kind of mind map of your vendor ecosystem. So again, I think in the last 2 years, this used to be really hard. This type of advice would be something that would go take a week or 2 to do. Now all it takes is probably 2 or 3 hours of your time by just talking to the right people and asking the right questions. So now let's talk about how we improve this situation. Because before, we have integrations and data vendor types. How do we actually fix this connections problem? So the first is obvious documentation. We just talked about that. Standing operating procedures, that's also a great process problem you can solve. We talked about investigation documents. We also talked about investigation documentation. I can't stress it enough though, like one of the only solutions at scale as you grow to the calamity of lots of people and lots of tools is creating some system that works for you and your organization around how to do stuff. Again, there's lots of words for the same thing. Run books, playbooks, SOPs, how-to guides, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter. Have a central source of truth where you document how to do things. That way you can actually allow people to enter the safe space of using your tools. And I think about Ramp, a big problem that we had was not that I wanted to block access to like all the BAs across HubSpot and Salesforce. That's the like everybody was doing things without a common understanding of how to do things. And so the more you can do to maybe document how things are done, the more you can then pull away from being like a an admin overlord. Give people more permission, give them trust and transparency, because you put in place a ritual and a process for how that knowledge is federated. And at some point, the community will start to self-regulate it. At least that's what we felt at Ramp is in the beginning. We had to kind of move in one direction, which was maybe very dogmatic and a little bit authoritarian. Like, okay, we're going to take away everybody's access at first, and we're not going to let people do these things. But over time, as they started to document things, and we built that trust that, hey, people, if they know how to do something, they'll be doing it the right way. And if they don't know how to do something, they'll be asking in the right channels and they'll be documenting in the right ways. That allows you to then put the trust back on individuals, right? It's a process of like retraining your team to serve themselves. There's also the actual infrastructure. So, this can't be ignored here. I think, like, again, I talk a lot about the framework of moving from pre-product market fit to enterprise. As you move towards enterprise, you have to think about everything as a production grade system. HubSpot and Salesforce are literally databases. So any database inside of an application-driven software company is going to have intense engineering support and monitoring around it. If your stack doesn't have that, and you have an engineering CTO or a tech leader who doesn't think about these things in the same way, I think it's your job to go convince them that they're actually the same. You should have alert reporting on top of your scaled systems. You should have anomaly detection. You should have an on-call system or an on-call engineer. Now, you may not be resourced to do these things yourself, but if you make the case for why they should be and how things will be so much better if they are, then you might be able to kind of leverage some of the support of engineering to get this stuff done. And I remember that's exactly what we did at Ramp, is we moved from a world where there was no on-call engineer, no on-call marketing specialist or RevTech specialist, to a shared on-call model where we went out and actually taught a variety of engineers how to use Salesforce, how to use HubSpot, how to diagnose basic things. We created a playbook for any engineer who knows how APIs works can like look at these 5 things and diagnose a problem pretty quickly. So now you can actually have an on-call system that's not just you as a solo RevTech person doing the best you can alone. And I see we typically use, I got a question from Jehan. What type of alerts do you use? Typically used 2 to 4 standard devs, a lot of false reporting due to volatility, unmanaged. It's a good question, Jehan. I would say, like, for me, it was all about like just like total uptime, not even about anomaly reporting. We did something super basic. We had Amplitude as our product analytics tool, and they have a built-in anomaly reporting tool. And we just use the out-of-box anomaly detection because I was like, nobody here is checking. Nobody wants to be checking. So let's just use the simple, basic out-of-box suite. And that will at least give me some visibility to go and check for my team. But what's funny is, like, you can find yourself in the same type of duplication problems that we've talked about, where you could be setting up anomaly detection inside the warehouse via Looker. You could also have anomaly detection inside Amplitude. You could also have it through, another tool. And so the question is, like, what is the source of truth? Where should you be doing anomaly detection? Who's responsible for it? And in my case, like, this is a great example of good duplication, good redundancy, where like it never really hurts to be alerted about a problem in multiple places, because if one of those places goes down or is maybe not as sensitive as you want, you at least are aware. And I found that, some of the problem with abstracting this responsibility to, say, the data engineering team is they may not always have the bandwidth to keep these things up to date, whereas you as an operator may be able to just keep it up to date through a WYSIWYG tool, again, like Amplitude. So this is where I would maybe consider good redundancy, like finding a problem before it occurs is good redundancy. And the specific case with Ramp was we had a lead sign up event that occurred on our website. And I'm like, I do not want to ever hear from my CEO that I'm finding out that this event is down. So it's like, I'm putting anomaly detection on the event, and all of the server events that are in that funnel, I'm putting anomaly detection on for myself. I don't care what data does, because like I can't be the last person to figure this out, because that my ass is gonna get fired if I do that. But for everything else, for the 95% of events that happen in the app that might affect us, having them through looker detection was probably fine, and I can just give that to our data engineering team and they can help manage it. What is roughly the right stage or scale to start seriously consider these observability use cases? I would say this is the answer to like almost all questions about what's the right time. The right time is where it's taking up more of your time to do it on a one-off basis than to manage it with a process. So for example, for us, it was right away. As soon as we entered the organization, it was like, oh, something is breaking every week. Like, I can't spend my Mondays every week diagnosing systems issues. So I think for us, it was like, this was a pretty important problem to solve pretty quickly. But even still, it took Justin and I maybe 8 months of like working through untangling the stack, decommissioning tools, upgrading permissions, putting processes in place, just to get to the point where it's like, there's not so much alerting happening that this is a useful tool. So that maybe is like answering your question in a roundabout way, is that Michael, is like, if you're in an organization where this is a huge problem already, maybe you don't want to put it in place immediately, because it's just going to exacerbate the problem. It's just going to remind you of all the problems in place. If you're in a place where, hey, we've had a couple of issues, and I never want to find myself in a place where I'm not aware of the issue, you can get ahead of it. I would say somewhere in that growth trajectory of like, if you're a Series B or Series C company, and you're starting to be more than just yourself as an operator, is a really good time to start thinking about it. But there's tons of trade-offs and caveats, right? It's like, how much are you willing to pay for it? I know, for example, with Amplitude, it was a premium feature. It cost us $4,000. For Ramp, that was fine. It didn't matter for us. We paid the amount and we're okay with it. But for a smaller team, that might be a really large chunk of change that you have to negotiate and think about. So I would just be considering things like, hey, is this something I can do myself? Do we have the capital for it? Is this something another team can own? And what trade-offs do I want to make there? Great questions, though. Keep them coming. Did those answer your questions, though, Jehan and Michael?
Yeah, I think so. Just to maybe give you some additional context on mine. So I'm a one-person RevOps team at a 50-person Series B startup, right? So I've been thinking about, kind of in the back of my mind, observability of the RevTech stack for a while, and I know we're kind of early in that, because I place a lot of value in finding out about problems before they happen, or before other people, right, tell me that something's broken. And so sometimes, I mean, I have a lot of like Slack alerts set up just as DMs to myself, right, to find out about these things. And sometimes it can be upwards of like 30 minutes a day of just processing alerts. And it's not always things that are broken. It's just more information gathering for myself to remind myself of everything that's happening, right? And so I'm just thinking, as we continue to scale, and I'll probably continue to be a one-person team, how do I kind of productize that, all those observability alerting use cases, so to speak? So I guess nothing specific. It's just something I'm thinking about.
My number one piece of advice to you is, don't have it in private DMs to yourself. Create channels for this stuff, right? Even if you're the only person in the channel, you should be thinking about the day when you get asked or promoted to hire another person on your team. And if you have all these private DMs, what are you going to do? You're going to go do all that work to basically undo it again. And this is a really common thing too, so I'm not like trying to pick on you. It's just like, a lot of times when you're in growth mode, you only think about the team for yourself. But as soon as you get out of growth mode, it's all about me, team, and how do we operate together. So the simple things you can do right now are just like, again, a public channel, right? Again, you're the only person there. You're the only person getting those alerts. But at least then if the CEO or somebody else asks you, hey, like, did you know about this problem? What were you doing to have some advanced recognition, you can add them to the Slack channel and be like, this is all my work that I have to process and go through. So that would be like a really tactical thing I would just think about, maybe slowly starting to do. Also with the public channel, then maybe you invite other people who have good ideas about how to improve the process, or at least give them visibility into what the types of problems are that you deal with on a day-to-day basis. Cool. Thank you guys for those questions. That was great. We're going to keep moving along here. So the last kind of root cause is obviously like tools, the actual software platforms, and the tech stack itself. And I think where I see a really common pattern is that you experience a symptom. Hey, marketing is complaining at me. They feel like it's really hard to do reporting in Salesforce. So they want to go use this tool that lives on top of Salesforce that does reporting better. And this is a classic example of like, hey, I have a toothache, so I'm just going to take an Advil. Like, I'm not going to go to the dentist. Or hey, I'm sick. I'm just going to go slam a NyQuil and like hope for the best. So it's this jump from symptom to solution without the root cause analysis and the work to be done to figure out what is the right medication or antidote to the problem. And this is obvious, and you guys probably all do this in different ways, but I like to always have like a recurring document of vendor feedback. This is like something I've created at literally every job. Is I create first day, you literally create a Google sheet, and it's just like tool, problem, who reported it, when was the date. And the reason why that's really important is because your memory is not very good. Like, I'm not like making fun of anybody here. It's just like, we're humans, we're infallible, we're not databases. So you'll get complaints all the time and you'll remember it, but literally patterns won't occur until you've probably been told a problem 20 times. And if you have a process for documenting feedback better, you don't have to wait to get to, to number 20 before you notice the pattern occurring, and you can start figuring out the solution to it. So this is just an example of something I create: a tool, essential features, current capabilities, gap, workaround available, replacement needed. This is a more robust version. Again, if thinking about AI and GPT tools, you can go into GPT or Claude, and you create a project space and basically give it a prompt and be like, hey, Claude, I want your help acting like a PM to basically catalog feedback over the next 120 to 180 days. I want you to format it in this document structure. And every time I write a problem to you, prompt me if I'm missing information. And then basically the second you're in a call or you have a meeting discussion, you have a Slack, you just throw it inside the GPT. And over time, you'll have this living document. Now, every once in a while, you might want to pull that feedback out of GPT so you can share it with people. But this is one of the best ways ever to like kind of diagnose what is the actual tooling problem that's going to help solve the symptoms that you're feeling. And then obviously, like, sometimes you actually have to go to the dentist and you're at the dentist and you're like, okay, well, what is like, how should my dentist operate here? And we don't have time to go into maybe like a really, really deep detail around vendor qualification, but I think like the number one thing I can maybe leave everybody with is that vendor selection is, increasingly one of the most important jobs that I think RevTech has. There was a great article by Aaron Hoffman, who was the CEO of Ramp, like the not the credit card company, but the data distribution company, and he just talks about the fact that increasingly, as we're living in a world where AI can effectively do jobs for us, and we imagine we'll have agents that are working across tools, then figuring out what tools to use, why, when, and where is actually like a higher level problem that most people are not considering. And you also got to think about like how do people really choose tools today? Maybe not in this cohort, but my experience has been they basically just pick the tool that they used before. And maybe some of you are thinking to yourself like, hey, that's kind of what I do too, and that's totally fine. But moving to a world where you actually have a real process for how you select tools, even if it's miniature in nature. For example, at Clarify, we don't have an end-to-end process, but one of the things I like to do when somebody asks for a tool is I just ask the question, like, have we looked at alternatives? Why are we picking this tool? What problem is it going to solve? Did we do any type of diligence to understand this would work, or is it in a category of its own where there are no other alternatives? And and so this is the typical process you might follow. You'd obviously document the why. You kind of develop some type of change plan of like, okay, if we're going to do this process in the first place, switch from tool A to point B, this is how it would work. You obviously want to start taking the action to back up any data you have in that tool. For example, when we switched off of Intercom to Qualified, I actually paid for the Intercom warehouse connector to basically pull all of our data into the warehouse. So we had a backup copy of it, did that on a 6-month trial, made sure I had it. That way, if we do want to switch back, we are not screwed. Another thing, you don't always have to do this. This is part of the process. I'd call it optional, but you can also run tools in parallel to see how they might compete with one another, or run like a bake-off between the tools to understand how they're going to work. And then you kind of decide where in the tool or stack to fix the data and how to migrate off that old tool. And I think this is an artifact in the lesson guide, but if it's not, I'll definitely send it to you. I have a framework for selecting a bunch of MarTech tools that I did not totally adapt to RevTech, but I think it's really good. You guys could literally just fill it out on your own based on the tool category, because in it, there's effectively a subject matter expertise column. There are columns for each person on your team who's evaluating certain criteria. There are rows for the criteria that you have, and there's a point scale system. And one of the things I would say that you need to do as you approach scale and enterprise is treating vendor selection processes as community building efforts. Because when you're a pre-product and post-market fit company, you don't really need to have a formalized document to get buy-in. You can just talk to everybody. It's a team of 3 or 4. Your line, cool. When you get to growth and scale, people are going to ask questions around why you chose the tool. And so you actually need the documentation not only to verify your answer and why you did something, but to get people aligned around the decision you're making. So I have that framework. And again, not to like just say, hey, use GPT, but I'm increasingly finding that what's most important is, hey, here's a version of the template, put it into Claude or GPT and make it your own. And if it would be helpful, maybe in the next class, I can show you how I'd prompt my way through a new template, if that would be useful. And I see we got some questions here. No, just some comments. Just reading, this is great. So we're at the end of the first section on auditing your tech stack. There's a bunch of slides on lead gen, maybe 5 of them. I think it would probably be better just to actually switch and use 8 minutes of questions. And you guys can obviously see these slides afterwards. And if you want to talk about lead gen, I can carve out some time to show you lead gen on Wednesday. How does that sound? Cool. I'm feeling vigorous agreement from everybody. So what are some questions that people have coming out of this session?
Okay, I'll go. I know if no one
Yeah.
else, I ask a lot of questions, as you guys probably have seen. So I always want to give others a chance. So we're in a situation where almost every tool you look into, if you go into admin and check out the integrations, there's like 30 or 40 different integrations in there. So it's like the epitomal mess. I'm like struggling to even draw our diagram at the moment. So just given some of the things you went through in the first little bit here, talking about managing change, you talked about managing change at the tool level, but any advice on managing the change in terms of cleaning that stuff up? When do you do the sort of draconian, like we're going to shut everyone's access down so we don't proliferate the mess? And I imagine you've been through this a few times.
Yeah, I mean, this was the problem to solve at Ramp, which is so sad because it's like it's such a corporate problem. Like, hey, we got too many admins. That's literally the problem in a nutshell. The issue is that, hey, admins have unlimited access to make any change with no consequences and no understanding of what they're doing. And the challenge we had is that many of the admins were junior non-engineering operators, so like BSAs, BAs, and they didn't have complete context into how a tool change in something like Salesforce might affect tools upstream or downstream. So the first thing we did, which is really simple, is we created admin groups, permissioning groups in both Salesforce and HubSpot that were aligned to one another. So this was a documentation process. Me, Justin, Nate, our head of sales ops, Cliff, our head of marketing ops, sat down together and we said, okay, look, we can't have all these people as admins. Let's carve out what groups need access to what pieces of each tool. And let's just come up with some nomenclature for it together. Again, sounds really simple, but having a shared experience there, like, leading that charge and creating the shared access groups means that people, like the leaders of those functions, then had buy-in and were willing to take the heat if their BSAs were like, WTF, I can't do my job anymore, right? So you create these groups, go and implement them inside of Salesforce and HubSpot. And we did all tools. We did Segment as well, did all the tools connected to HubSpot. Anything that had the ability to create a permission group, we created a permission group. Something we did at the same time, though, this really applies to both to growth and enterprise companies, is we went to our IT department and we said, hey, John, our head of IT, we're like, we want you to create these groups inside of Okta. That way, when somebody onboards, we can actually assign the right permission group to them by default. And we have a really robust IT procurement process in place where if you have any IT issue at Ramp, you go to IT help and they'd help solve it. So we were seeding them to kind of educate users on, no, you're not going to be an admin. This is the permission you're allowed to get. And if you want to have help, fill out this form, right? And then that form was literally just an Asana link that said, hey, I'm requesting access to a specific tool for heightened access. Here are the different tool options. This is why I need access to it. Here's my manager. All right. So like now if a BSA joins and they're able to do a job, they want to do something, they can ask for permission to do it. And we can actually then turn that into a ticket. Like, hey, what you're asking to do is totally reasonable, but you shouldn't do it. This is going to go to Cliff. He's going to go do it for you. Right. So it just helps teach people that the way to solve the problem is not to ask for admin permission and then go do the thing. It's to say that the thing needs to be done and then figure out the right avenue for who does the job. Now, I would argue this is a very growth and enterprise way of solving problems. If you're a one person, I think it was Michael, weren't you saying like you're a one person team at at your company, maybe you don't want to do this, right? You maybe want to have a couple of other admins, because if you go on vacation and some shit is broken, you are so screwed, right? So it's like you maybe don't want to adopt this advice, but certainly as you scale, as you get to 10, 15, 20 people, this is something you should be thinking about and keeping in your mind. So then once we did that, we like rolled everybody off of admins into different groups. We just had like a week-long period where we're educating everybody on this is what's happening. This is what's going to happen to your access. This is the date we're doing it. If you have any problems and you can't do your job, raise your hand. And then we just did it. We didn't wait for permission. We just ripped the Band-Aid. And we found is that, the people who really needed access to do their job raised their hand and complained. And then we were able to carve special groups for them. And that kind of becomes the go forward methodology, is you stop giving people admin access and you start carving out groups for special people who need heightened access depending on their role. So it's like our email marketing was like, hey, I actually need the ability to almost be an admin in HubSpot because of the job that I'm doing. Like, great, okay, so you're the head of email marketing. So we'll create a head of email marketing role for you, right? And that's only for you and maybe another person who's the head of marketing, but you're not going to have access to billing, and you're not going to be able to change your SSO permissions. You're not going to be able to like do all this other stuff that usually gets bundled into the admin permission role. For what it works, even at Clarify, like I'm very resistant to adding admins to any tool that's outside of engineering land. Engineering's hard because I think there's a lot of kind of developer friendly tools that like only have two role types, like member and admin. And if you're an engineer, you need to be an admin to like change the API settings. So I have some exceptions to that, but for REST tools, I don't. And again, if unfortunately in Clarify, we haven't built these because permissions are really hard. It's like such an enterprise feature as well that like a lot of companies just don't build it till later.
I have a question. It might be more of like a cultural thing, so tell me if you can't help, but that's cool.
Sure.
I had a situation where our Segment and HubSpot integration was regularly malfunctioning. So Segment would tag our new leads or new signups rather as an offline integration. Now that page was kind of owned by the product team. And so like from a marketing standpoint, they wouldn't necessarily like help us figure out a systematic way to like debug it. We knew it was a problem because we couldn't really identify where people were coming from. But because there wasn't really like shared ownership of both pages and all the tools, there was always a little bit of a push and pull around like, well, it's not that big of a problem. We're still getting signups. It doesn't matter. Whereas from a marketing standpoint, I was like, wait, we need to like, I want to know where these people are coming from. Like, I want to understand that user journey. So I'm wondering, like, is there a way that like that you've seen where we could set up that kind of shared ownership properly between like product and marketing, let's say?
Yeah. I mean, I think it depends on the context you're operating in. Like, do you have buy-in and support from engineers and product? If not, you have to go on a little bit of an expedition to create that relationship. That was a key consideration for me in joining Ramp, is that I was working with our co-founder, Gene, who was the head of growth engineering. And I said up front, this is going to fail if we don't have growth engineering support, because MarTech and RevTech don't have engineers. So all this stuff is engineering. Systems is engineering. That's like a common misconception that you probably all feel. And the reason why you're here is that y'all are, in a way, technical PMs. You're just not called technical PMs. So I think it's up to you to go build the relationships with your product and engineering leaders and get the buy-in and support. The outcome should be, hey guys, like I manage 12 different databases. It's just I don't have engineers to manage those databases. And I need help and support. And what I'd like to do is get to a point where I can have some buy-in on our roadmap. I'm not asking you guys to solve every problem I have, but what I am asking for is to have allocation on the roadmap to solve problems that are important to me. And then I can become a little bit more like a PM as well. I can pick and choose the problems to solve in the right order to fit the needs of the business. Now, if that conversation is not happening, that's where you have to escalate to your manager, either the CMO or the head of product. But what I would probably start with is, and I don't know your reporting structure, Kaylee, but like if you have a peer on product and engineering, I would get with them in the same room and talk about the fact that these tools are engineering tools, and sometimes they will require engineering updates. And it should not be up to product and engineering to look at what you're saying and evaluate and decide whether it's important or not. You should bring to them the things that are important, and they should carve out roadmap to solve those problems, because that empowers you to be an owner. Otherwise, they're babysitting you. And to be honest, I'd be like, fuck you if you're babysitting me, like, like I didn't come here to be babysat.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Thank you.
We are at the top of the hour. I love the questions though. This was awesome. I let you all know the rest of the slides are going to be available to you. If you read over them, you're like, hey, I actually would really love to go deeper into lead gen. We can do that. Otherwise, email, text me, call me, tell me what are the things you want to cover in the last session on Wednesday. It will all be based on the questions that we get. So it can be anything from RevTech to scuba diving to Pokemon, whatever you guys want to talk about. It's your time to use. Thank you guys so much for all the input and effort so far. Really appreciate it. It's just been awesome having you guys here.
Thanks, Austin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
See you Wednesday. Bye.